with regard to lipids and atherosclerosis, I think that if you are going to say, and we started the podcast talking about, is apoB causal in atherosclerosis? And I think that that's an important question. And I want to bring it back to the idea that I think that it's important to have these conversations because I want to understand, and I want us as a community to understand what the most important metrics are with regard to reduction of cardiovascular risk. We're not taking this lightly. As you said, cardiovascular risk is a huge thing for humans. And I think that also, as we talked about, we're all going to die of something. And if we can decrease our cardiovascular risk while also decreasing our risk of other diseases by potentially aligning the way that we eat and live with something that is compatible for our human physiology as best as we can tell from our outside looking in, then I think that that's a great outcome. And I think that when it comes to lipids, it's important to understand that I don't think looking at apoB is the best single metric to look at cardiovascular risk. And I believe that because of all the things we talked about, because of the way that apoB regarding to cardiovascular disease changes when you stratify for anything that reflects insulin resistance, when you look at other things that can change the susceptibility of humans to cardiovascular disease, like oxidized lipids coming from things in the diet. And I think that there is a significant change in our risk of cardiovascular disease. I would say a massive change, like a continental change. I mean, a huge, the biggest risk reduction that you don't see risk reductions like that with anything, right? So there's no intervention that you can do to a human that will give you the risk reduction that you see from just becoming an insulin sensitive human in these trials that I mentioned, or based on the proxies. And I think these are reasonable proxies. We don't have a study with fasting insulin that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean that HDL is not a reasonable proxy for insulin sensitivity. So there is no single intervention that you can do as a human that is better or anywhere close to becoming an insulin sensitive human with regard to your cardiovascular risk, regardless of whether we believe apoB is causal in atherosclerosis or not. I don't think the data is there to say that it's actually causal. And I think that if we're actually going to look at apoB as a causative factor in atherosclerosis, we have to be honest about the fact that apoB enriched, or apoB containing lipoproteins enriched in linoleic acid, are much more damaging to the endothelium than those that have lower populations of linoleic acid. Where does that come from? That comes from the diet. That's not questionable at all. So if apoB is going to be damaging or in any way a proximate cause of atherosclerosis, there's an asterisk there, and that is that it's much worse when you have more linoleic acid and more polyunsaturated fatty acids in general in your diet. So going back to the single greatest thing you can do, even more than potentially, or just as much as lowering your apoB, becoming insulin sensitive will lower your risk. And so then we have to have conversations about why are we insulin resistant as humans and how do you become more insulin sensitive? We didn't really get to that, maybe another podcast, but I think that the high level there is that it's pretty clear that insulin resistance, essentially the ground zero for that is in the adipocytes and the fat cells, and that broken fat cells send out inflammatory, potentially aberrant signals to the rest of the body, creating pathological insulin resistance in the body. So that there are these adipocytes that have had their ability to become hyperplastic and they're stuck in kind of this hypertrophic phase. They're dysfunctional adipocytes in insulin resistance. And when that happens, we become insulin resistant in a pathological level. And I think that there are lots of things pointing to the fact that there are downstream products of linoleic acid metabolism like 4-HNE that are worsening that process again. And so it's like that I think is potentially a way to tie it all together and give people some sort of a perspective. Don't be insulin resistant. Know how to check your sensitivity of insulin. And I would say that from my perspective, like we talked about, given that you have a normal level of thyroid function, given that you don't have a genetic predisposition to hyperlipidemia, like we talked about the FH, genotype versus phenotype aside, and become insulin resistant. And I think that significantly lowers your risk of cardiovascular disease. And I think that that's probably where I would leave it. Does that make sense? Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, I think like the main takeaway that sums it all up for me as well, because I get pointed to the FH literature as a proxy for potentially expected outcome for somebody who's also insulin sensitive and has high apoB numbers or whatever.
Right.
So basically the takeaway on your proposed stance is in that data, those individuals that have accelerated atherosclerosis are not insulin sensitive like an individual who has a high apoB but has the low fasting insulin, good thyroid values, and that individual is not to be apples to apples compared to this person.
Not to be apples to apples compared necessarily because of insulin sensitivity, but because of metabolic dysfunction at the level of the macrophages. Because we know that, and this is something I didn't talk about in the podcast, again, we went all over the place, but perhaps now I'll throw in a few things to corroborate this model. Like,
hopefully you can acknowledge it's hard to stay organized in these subjects.
it is hard to
Yeah,
stay organized.
yeah.
But the problem is that, you know, when, from my perspective also, like if I'm trying to make a coherent argument, there are things that you think of like, oh, I should have talked about that too.
Yeah.
So there are situations, I mean, if someone is going to point out to you the FH literature with regard to somebody that's insulin sensitive, I would say, okay, that's metabolic dysfunction at the level of the macrophages. We'll wait for Dave's study, which I think I'm pretty darn positive is going to show us that there's something else going on here in an insulin sensitive population of people who have very elevated levels of apoB akin to FH. And I think we're going to see something pretty interesting and special there. So that's going to really put, I think, the FH literature in context. But at least in this podcast, I wanted to talk about why the FH literature is not to be interpreted without a very major asterisk by it. And I'm happy to send you all that stuff about the macrophages there. But then there are multiple examples of people with elevated levels of apoB that do not have accelerated atherosclerosis. And I'm thinking specifically now of GSD1A, which is von Gerke's disease. It's a glycogen storage disease. It's a genetic defect in glucose 6-phosphatase, I believe. And these people have elevated levels of apoB and no accelerated atherosclerosis. So again, what's going on here? Is there something protective? We've never been able to find it in the literature. And again, I feel like these things with the GSD1A get left out of these Mendelian randomizations because these people are an outlier.
And they don't have atherosclerosis like at all, or
Accelerated.
lower...
They don't have accelerated, so they're just getting atherosclerosis at their age cohort, but
they're still getting it.
They still get it, but they just elevated apoB.
But are they insulin sensitive to the level you would deem it?
They're only insulin sensitive as the general population is insulin sensitive, and they're getting atherosclerosis at the same rate as the general population, right? They're not getting accelerated atherosclerosis. So what I'm saying is there are examples like this of people with elevated apoB who do not get accelerated atherosclerosis. So again, if apoB is causal in atherosclerosis, that breaks the model. Similarly, there are examples of people who do not have elevated apoB, familial Dunnington hyperlipidystrophy, or just Dunnington lipodystrophy. These people have monogenic insulin resistance, and they get massive, aggressive atherosclerosis with no elevation of apoB. So there's, again, these things that sort of break the mold make me think there's something else going on here. And this, perhaps I'm mischaracterizing it, but this singular focus on apoB, I think is missing the importance of the conversations around insulin resistance and the power of changing your insulin sensitivity for all these models.
I think perhaps the ultimate kind of like ambiguity is people being worried that what they do on the lifestyle front will not achieve the outcome of guaranteeing the spark of the flame. Like the wood they can manually manipulate, which they feel, gives them a sense of comfort knowing that some variable amount of spark, they can control it significantly through lifestyle, diet, etc. But it's like, at least with the apoB number, you kind of know there's a target whereby there's not enough wood to cause the fire versus like the sparks, the insulin sensitivity, the ROS, the et cetera, endothelial damage caused by other things that isn't just inherent to the apoB particle itself. Like it's a bit more vague as to knowing you're covered. So I think it's more like a sense of security too, in that like I don't know who is asserting that like just apoB in the complete absence of sparks equates to like you will 100% get atherosclerosis at like a manic rate. I don't know if that's actually asserted.
I mean, I think that
like I don't think that. Like I obviously think
good.
that if you're unhealthy as hell, like you're gonna get way worse outcomes than if you were healthy. Like that's pretty common sense.
Right, but when people say apoB causes atherosclerosis,
but I guess it's just the semantic verbiage.
Exactly, and that's important
because it's like
clarify.
the wood spark thing. I think is a good way to probably conclude in that. I think most people can agree the common sense behind this thing is needed, but it's not the only thing that matters. In that you need a constellation of other things to like combine and cause the fire.
Right, but remember that if we're staying with that metaphor, wood helps build a house. Right, that LDL has value.
And then you get to the threshold amount that is necessary for the house, and that's probably where the disagreement comes in.
Right, and the potential long-term problems with lowering it beyond that threshold, which we don't really know what that is.
Which the traditional people would assert
it's pretty low. Exactly. You can also look at, there's also interesting data. So a complete lack of cholesterol formation is called Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, and these people, these children are developmentally disabled massively, and their cured or helped by they're given egg yolks. They're given huge amounts of cholesterol. So they have essentially very, very low LDL because they can't make cholesterol, right? And so these children do have developmental disability. They do have insulin resistance. They do have many issues.
I think everyone knows there's a threshold necessity.
Yes, there is a threshold of necessity. And the question is then, what is that threshold of necessity? I might argue that it's much higher than what someone else would argue if they're saying neonatal levels of cholesterol, which, again, perhaps we need to do more things in terms of remodeling different tissues of our body as we age. Perhaps it's possible that neonatal levels of cholesterol are not adequate for humans throughout our lifespan for all of the things we need to do. Formation of adult male and female sex hormones, remodeling of the brain, or anything that we do. And so and I think that my argument would be, and this would be an interesting conversation to continue with some of these people who are on the other side of the equation solely for the purpose of trying to help advance the collective knowledge, that that LDL has positive roles in the human body, immune functions, et cetera. And, these are just associational studies, epidemiology studies, but in many of the most long-lived people, there are elevated levels of LDL. And so people have argued that, okay, there are these people with low LDL, which is what happens when you get a cancer or something. You get a cancer and your LDL levels drop. I've actually seen this clinically. Right before someone dies of a cancer, sometimes the lipoproteins go very low. And so they'd say, oh, that data is skewed by the fact that low LDL in cancer. And so then an elevated LDL might look good for longevity. But there are many studies. These are all associational because there's no interventional studies in humans where we can actually give them lipids. We never give someone LDL in today's world. But it's very clear that in these long-lived cohorts, there are actually higher levels of LDL. And so, but many of these studies that have been done, whether it's the Leiden 85 cohort or the Edinburgh studies, they have accounted for this. They've excluded people who died in the last few years from cancer to try and limit this bottom end artifact. And so there is data on the other end that this wood is valuable for humans, especially as we age in terms of immune function, other things. And so perhaps that's where it boils down to. But I think that the entire conversation must be framed around this idea, which is really how I get involved in this, which is I would say for most humans who are not ketogenic, is a 20% increase in apoB going to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease in any significant way when you include more red meat or organs or nutrient-rich foods that also happen to be rich in saturated fats and lower in polyunsaturated fats? We talked about why those may have different effects on your LDL levels or apoB levels. Is that going to affect your cardiovascular risk in any particularly negative or positive way? And that's the important part of the conversation, because my impression, perhaps it's wrong from the other side, and I guess I shouldn't make it so tribal, but the other perspective is that will increase your risk. And I think that there's a lot of things to suggest that it won't.
I would imagine there would be like a net, even if it was, there would be like obviously net benefit to having enhanced, vitality, health processes, functionality, et cetera, that again, it comes to the ROI side of the equation. It's like, because at average levels, like you could have atherosclerotic potential, and then even if you increase it 20%, it's like maybe it's the same potential, but like it could be equal, and maybe it's lesser so because you get higher quality health in the sparks discussion. But it's like,
well, we talked about that, cardiovascular disease versus dementia versus diabetes versus cancer versus
those individuals that are older and have that high LDL, by the way, do they stratify by insulin sensitivity in those to determine like why are they old and have these like longevity outcomes? Is it protective genes or what is it?
I've never seen it stratified by
so no one knows like why they're like living longer.
No, I don't think that anybody's looked at that. I think it's just cohorts of people that are living a long amount of time that are just they do see that the elevated level of LDL is often there. And so there's the inference is there's some benefit there, that if you presumably, one hypothesis would be, well, these are people who had reasonably enough good lifestyle and habits that they weren't terribly insulin resistant in their lives. And then you see them with perhaps apoBs of something like mine, 130 or 120. And then that at least could potentially be protective in these studies as we age. And I think it could be protective throughout the lifespan, just that we see it more clearly in these people who are elderly because the signal becomes more clearly separated from the noise because the people that were insulin resistant or the people that had lower lifestyle level died.
Right.
So who are the survivors that show us that? So again, it goes back to the wood has benefit. So how much wood do you need to build a house? And I think that my hypothesis, which is just my hypothesis, is that look, in a lot of humans that I work with and that I see, like an apoB of 120 is not uncommon, or 90 to 120 or 110.
What do you think is the necessary amount? Or is it too specific of a question?
So hard. I don't know. I don't know how I'd answer that question.
Like a number that you would not feel uncomfortable seeing is like, dude, why is your number so low?
I think that I would actually approach it from a different perspective I would put some context in it. If someone is eating a very low processed food diet and they're eating nutrient-rich foods and they're getting a mix of macronutrients, and they're insulin sensitive and their thyroid is good as far as high level metrics, then if their LDL is, if their apoB is 90 or 80, then that's where your body wants to be. But I think a lot of times, and I think there are genetics that probably modify this or moderate this, we do see about a 20% increase in apoB when people have more saturated fat and less polyunsaturated fats. Potentially for the reasons I mentioned earlier, oxidative stress in the liver leading to degradation of apoB 100. There's also a model called the homeoviscous model of adaptation, looking at the fluidity of membranes and the way that the body might insert cholesterol versus not insert cholesterol into the membrane to maintain the fluidity. So I think that the other piece of this equation, and I appreciate you giving me a little more time here to kind of just flesh this out so people kind of see more of the context of what we're talking about, is that elevations in apoB, I don't believe are always pathological in certain contexts. But as we talked about, not across the board.